When we hear the word demon today, most of us already have a fairly clear idea of what that means. We usually think of something evil, dangerous, deceptive, or opposed to God. But the history behind some of these figures is more complicated than that. In some cases, beings later remembered as demons were once connected to gods, spirits, local powers, or sacred figures from older cultures. They were not always understood in the way later religions came to describe them. Some were worshipped. Some were feared and respected. Some were tied to storms, fertility, protection, illness, death, or the identity of a particular people. That does not mean every demon was once a god, and it does not mean every ancient god was simply misunderstood. But it does raise an interesting question. How does a being once seen as divine become remembered as something evil? That is the question I want to explore in this first episode of Divine Inventions. This channel is about the stories, symbols, beliefs, and ideas humans have created to understand the world. Not to mock them and not to accept every tradition at face value, but to look at where these ideas came from, how they changed, and why they still shape the way people think today. To understand how a god could become a demon, we have to step back into a world where religion was not separate from daily life. For many ancient societies, the divine was woven into almost everything. Farming, birth, illness, storms, war, kingship, law, death, and the changing seasons could all be understood through gods or spirits. If rain came at the right time, it could mean survival. If the rains failed, people could starve. If disease spread through a town, people wanted an explanation. If a king ruled successfully, his power might be connected to divine favor. If a city survived a war, its people might believe their god had protected them. So when ancient people worshipped a god, they were not just choosing a figure from a mythology book. They were participating in a way of understanding reality. A god could be tied to a place, a people, a language, a family line, or a kingdom. A city might have a patron deity. A farming community might depend on a storm god. A ruler might claim the protection of a national god. A household might honor spirits connected to family and ancestry. That means gods were also part of identity. They helped answer not only, how does the world work, but also, who are we? And this is where things become complicated. When cultures met, their gods met too. Sometimes that contact was peaceful. People traded, intermarried, borrowed stories, adopted symbols, and noticed similarities between their gods and the gods of others. In some places, religious traditions blended together over time, but not every meeting between cultures was peaceful. People also met through war, conquest, exile, political rivalry, and religious reform. When one group began to define itself against another, the gods of the other group could become a problem. If your community believes it has the true God, the true temple, or the true way of worship, then the gods of your rivals are not just different. They may be seen as threats. Their rituals may be condemned. Their images may be destroyed. Their names may be preserved, not as sacred names, but as warnings. That kind of shift does not always happen quickly. It can take generations. But over time, the meaning of a name can change dramatically. One of the clearest examples is Baal. Today, many people hear that name and associate it with something dark or demonic. But in ancient Semitic languages, the word Baal could mean something like Lord or Master. It could be used as a title, and in different places it could refer to different local divine figures. In parts of the ancient Near East, Baal was connected with storms, fertility, power, and life-giving rain. That is important because in an agricultural world, a storm god was not a small figure. Rain was survival. It meant crops, food, stability, and the possibility of another season. So to the people who worshipped Baal, he was not a demon. He was a powerful divine figure, connected to forces that mattered deeply to everyday life. But in the religious world of ancient Israel and Judah, Baal also became a rival. Baal worship was condemned in biblical tradition, especially where it was seen as competing with the worship of Yahweh. Over time, the name became associated less with rain and fertility, and more with idolatry, corruption, and religious betrayal. That is the kind of transformation this episode is about. It is not that one group had a simple neutral description, and another group simply lied about it. Human beings are more complicated than that. To the people condemning Baal worship, this was not just politics or propaganda. It was a serious religious concern. They believed rival worship could corrupt their people and pull them away from their covenant with God. But from a historical point of view, we can still see how the same name could be understood very differently, depending on who was telling the story. For one community, Baal could represent rain, power, and divine authority. For another, Baal could represent temptation, false worship, and spiritual danger. The name stayed, but the meaning changed. This is one way a god can become a demon in cultural memory. A sacred figure from one tradition is carried into another tradition, but without the original devotion attached to it. The name survives, but it survives inside a hostile story. This pattern is not limited to Baal. Across history, religious communities have often defined themselves partly by explaining what they reject. That can include the practices, images, rituals, and divine beings associated with outsiders. A sacred image for one people can become an idol to another. A protective spirit in one tradition can become a dangerous spirit in another. A god connected to a defeated or rejected culture can survive only as a warning in the stories of those who came after. This is why memory matters so much. History is not only shaped by what happened, it is also shaped by who preserved the story, who translated it, who condemned it, and who had the power to pass their version on. If a temple falls, the god worshipped there may not disappear immediately. The name may survive. The symbols may survive. Pieces of the story may survive. But they may no longer be carried by people who honor them. Instead, they may be preserved by opponents, reformers, conquerors, or later religious writers. And those people may preserve the name for very different reasons. Not to worship it, but to warn against it. That does not mean we should romanticize every ancient deity as harmless or misunderstood. Ancient religions could be violent, political, hierarchical, and deeply tied to power. Some gods were frightening even to their own worshippers. Some spirits and monsters were imagined as dangerous from the beginning, and many demons were never gods at all. The better point is that religious categories have histories. Words like God, idol, spirit, angel, demon, and devil did not always carry the exact meanings they have for modern readers. Their meanings developed across languages, cultures, scriptures, politics, and centuries of interpretation. A being could move from one category to another. A local god could become a false god. A false god could become associated with evil. A dangerous spirit could be folded into a demonology. A rival religious symbol could become a moral warning. After enough time passes, those earlier layers become hard to see. The demon just seems like it was always a demon. The monster just seems like it was always a monster. The old god disappears behind the later label. This is part of what makes the history of religion so fascinating. Human beings do not only create stories about the divine, we revise them. We inherit names from the past and give them new meanings. We use sacred stories to explain the world, but also to explain ourselves. Who we are, what we trust, what we reject, what we fear, what we believe must be left behind. And when a culture wants to draw a hard line between itself and another group, the other group's gods can become part of that boundary. Over time, that boundary can become so familiar that we forget it was built by history at all. So how does a god become a demon? There is no single answer. Sometimes it happens through conquest. sometimes through religious rivalry, sometimes through translation, reform, fear of outsiders, sincere theological belief, or centuries of retelling. But in many cases, the transformation has less to do with the original worshippers and more to do with the people who remembered them afterward. That is what makes the question worth asking. When we study how divine figures change, we are also studying how humans preserve memory, reshape it, and sometimes distort it. We are studying how the sacred can become forbidden, how a rival can become a monster, and how a name can outlive the world that first gave it meaning. Some names that later became warnings were once prayers. Some figures later associated with evil were once connected to rain, land, power, protection, fertility, or identity. Long after the temples fell, the names remained, but the meanings changed. That does not make the later stories meaningless. It means they have a history. And if we want to understand them, we have to look at more than the final version. We have to ask what came before. In the next episode, we can look more closely at one of these names, Baal, and the later figure of Beelzebub, sometimes called the Lord of the Flies. How did a title connected with power become associated with something so much darker? And what does that transformation tell us about religion, rivalry, insult, and memory? This is Divine Inventions.